Welcome back to Somali Nexus, where we explore the stories, histories, and ideas that continue to shape the Somali experience. Today, we step into a chapter that many know of, but few truly understand. A chapter carved not by the Somali people themselves, but by distant powers drawing lines across a land they never walked. This episode, The Forgotten Frontiers, How Colonial Borders Shaped the Somali Nation, takes us back to a defining moment in our history. In the late 19th century, a single united people were split into separate territories by Britain, Italy, France, and Ethiopia. These borders didn't just divide land, they divided families, herds, and the natural rhythms that held Somali society together. We'll explore how this forced fragmentation gave rise to Pan-Somalism, the dream of reuniting a nation cut into 5 parts, a dream powerful enough to inspire independence movements, unite communities, and painfully drive Somalia into wars fought to reclaim what had been lost. But we're also looking at the long shadow of those borders, how they influenced the fall of the Somali state, the rise of Somaliland, and the lingering political and social fractures that still echo across the Horn of Africa today. This isn't just a story about maps, it's a story about identity, resilience, and the unfinished conversation about what Somali nationhood truly means. So settle in as we uncover how lines drawn long ago still shape the realities of Somalis everywhere. If you enjoy this episode, don't forget to follow Somali Nexus, share it with someone who cares about our history, and join the discussion. Your engagement helps us keep these stories alive.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we commit to the long view. We take these really complex geopolitical fault lines and trace them, sometimes centuries deep, right back to their origin point. Today, we are focusing on a crisis whose origins lie in a diplomatic act of, well, cynical cartography over a century ago. We're talking about the Horn of Africa, and specifically the nation that never was, Greater Somalia. Okay, let's unpack this. When we look at the catastrophic state collapse, the regional wars, the, relentless fragmentation that have defined the Somali territories for the last 3 decades, it's far too easy to focus on recent warlords or Cold War missteps. But our deep dive into the sources makes it abundantly clear. The root problem, the foundational trauma that dictates modern instability, is the profound and lasting impact of the late 19th century colonial partition of Somali inhabited lands. This isn't just dusty history.
No, it's not. It is the active, unresolved definition of instability in the region today.
That's a powerful statement.
Well, it is the essential insight. The core trauma here is rooted in an irreconcilable contradiction created in the space of about 2 decades. At the turn of the century, you had 4 competing imperial powers, Britain, Italy, France, and crucially, the expanding neighboring empire of Ethiopia, who arbitrarily decided to carve up a single culturally and ethnically homogeneous people, and they carved them up into 5 separate, unconnected territories. The result was a Somali nation that existed robustly in reality, in culture and language, but was utterly denied a legitimate political expression.
So the new colonial borders were perceived, rightly, as illegitimate, artificial lines drawn across a living map. And what did that lead to?
It led to the birth of a powerful ideological force, Pan-Somalism, or Greater Somalia. This movement wasn't merely a political wish or, a hopeful slogan. It became the sole driving force, the very raison d'etre of the post-colonial state created in 1960.
So the state's main purpose wasn't internal development.
Not at all. It viewed its primary purpose as the redemption of the lost parts of the nation.
And that mission, that commitment to irredentism, was encoded right into the national identity from the moment of independence.
Precisely. If you look at the national flag of the Somali Republic, that light blue rectangle with the white star designed in 1954, it is arguably the least abstract national symbol in Africa.
The 5-pointed star.
That is a 5-pointed star explicitly representing the 5 Somalias. When the Republic formed in 1960, only 2 of those points had united the former British and Italian territories.
Okay.
The flag therefore served as a constant constitutional reminder that 3 points, Djibouti, the Ogaden region held by Ethiopia, and the northern frontier district of Kenya, remained under foreign rule. That state was quite literally born with an irredentist mandate.
Our mission in this deep dive is to trace with specificity and detail how those forgotten frontiers, the lines drawn with such cynicism in London and Addis Ababa, led directly to the series of wars in the 1960s and 70s, the catastrophic state collapse in 1991, and the current political fragmentation, including the de facto independent Republic of Somaliland. We are going to show through every layer of the sources that the 19th century partition is, without exaggeration, the root problem of modern regional instability in the Horn. So, to understand the sheer volatility of those later borders, we have to start by thoroughly dispelling the colonial era justification for drawing them in the first place.
Right?
The prevailing European claim was that Somali society was disjointed and exploitable, lacking any coherent indigenous social or political structure.
That narrative, it sounds like a political convenience, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It was a convenient fiction used to justify partition, making it look like a civilizing administrative act rather than, a conquest and a theft.
And the reality was completely different.
The reality couldn't be more different. When you actually examine the cultural and sociological reality, the Somali people are recognized as one of Africa's most ethnically homogeneous countries.
Really? That's not a common perception? No, but it's true. They share a common Cushitic ethnicity. They speak a common language, and they share a strong unifying adherence to Sunni Islam, primarily of the Shafi'i school. This high degree of shared cultural Somaliness is why the subsequent partition was so traumatic. It wasn't the division of random tribes. It was the vivisection of a recognized and coherent nation.
But the sophistication went beyond just shared language and religion. The idea that they were stateless is a profound simplification, especially when you look at the complexity of their governance systems.
It's a total simplification. Absolutely. While it is true that political loyalty certainly rested on the individual's family, clan, and the vast nomadic interior.
Right.
The sources prove that Somali governance was never monolithic. It was a sophisticated system that included indigenous governments, city-states, and established sultanates running the coastal trade.
Can you give us some specific examples of these pre-colonial states that really challenged that stateless narrative?
Certainly. I mean, look at the Majeerteen Sultanate, which flourished in the northeast, running from the mid-18th century right up until the Italian conquest in 1927.
Okay.
Or the Sultanate of Hobyo, established later from 1878 to 1927. These were not simply chiefdoms governed by elders. Our sources detail that these sultanates exerted strong centralized authority and was possessed all of the organs and trappings of an integrated modern state.
So, what exactly did those trappings of an integrated modern state look like on the ground? We're not just talking about a flag, are we?
No, much more. We're talking a functioning hereditary bureaucracy, formalized taxation systems, courts that enforced legal codes, and crucially, a professional standing army. They did have their own state flag, signifying their status as recognized political entities.
And they were acting on the world stage.
They were. The most compelling evidence of their sovereignty, however, lies in their external relations. They were signing international treaties of their own accord, such as the 1889 Protectorate treaties with Italy. They were recognized sovereign actors.
So, the colonial powers just chose to ignore this.
They simply chose to characterize this complex political arrangement as stateless, by selectively focusing on the pastoral interior and ignoring these established treaty-signing polities.
So, this coexistence of centralized coastal sultanates, built on trade, and the decentralized pastoral clans built on livestock, that wasn't a political contradiction. It was a functional adaptation to diverse geography that the colonial powers deliberately chose to ignore to justify their civilizing administration.
Exactly. It was a pragmatic and adaptable political framework. And for that pastoral majority, which accounted for 4/5 of the population, their society was governed by an equally sophisticated, resilient structure, Xeer.
Okay, let's dedicate some time to Xeer. It's the unwritten Somali customary law. How did the system function as a kind of resilient indigenous government?
It's elegant in its simplicity and durability. It's an unwritten common law system, historically based on precedents.
So it's not static?
Not at all. This common law nature means it is constantly capable of evolving because it adapts based on past judicial decisions made by community elders. It governs everything from resource access to conflict resolution. It is, for the nomadic majority, the true constitution.
And its relevance isn't just historical. I mean, it's still operating today where state institutions have failed, right?
Absolutely. Even in modern northern Somalia, particularly in Somaliland, hair is the first recourse in dispute management. Some reliable estimates suggest it resolves between 80 to 90% of all disputes.
Wow, 80 to 90%?
Yes, far exceeding the reach or trust placed in modern statutory courts.
And its central mechanism is collective responsibility, enforced through these MAG-paying groups' blood compensation. So, the clan or the sub-clan acts as the ultimate insurance and legal enforcement entity. That's an immense amount of social capital and functional governance that the colonizers chose to dismiss.
It is the mechanism of MAG is essential to understanding Somali social fabric. When a wrong is committed, the extended kinship group is collectively responsible for paying compensation MAG to the victim's group.
Right.
This system forces conflict resolution and creates a powerful incentive for internal stability, because every individual's actions carry financial and social risk for the entire collective. It's a decentralized system of security and justice that function perfectly well without European centralized administration.
Which brings us squarely to the clash of territorial logics. If 4/5 of your population are nomadic pastoralists, how did their concept of territory clash fundamentally with the European Westphalian concept of a fixed linear border? Was it a misunderstanding or something more deliberate?
It was a conflict born out of fundamentally different cosmologies. For the pastoralists, the pre-colonial concept of territory was fluid, ecological, and resource-driven. It wasn't based on fixed lines. It was based on seasonal needs. Their economy depended entirely on seasonal movement or transhumans.
So they weren't occupying land in the way a European farmer would. They were using it in cycle.
Exactly. They divided their territories into lowland wet season pastures and highland dry season reserves. The control that mattered was centered on securing the strategic watering points, the burkad or cisterns, because that is where survival lay during the arid months. This mobility was the very economic engine of the society.
And the Europeans come in with their maps and rulers.
And when they arrived with surveying equipment and drew static linear lines, they criminalized the essential movement required for survival. It turned a functioning economic system into a political transgression.
So you have this powerful unifying cultural force, Islamic universalism, counterbalanced by deep clan particularism, where political loyalty rested on the individual's family clan, but the overall mechanism was sophisticated and functional. And it was this delicate, adaptable balance that the colonial project was about to shatter by imposing lines that severed economic, lifeblood, and cultural continuity. Here's where it gets really interesting. The Somali partition was uniquely cruel because it involved 4 competing powers, not just the 2 or 3 typical European rivals battling over a coastline.
And the architects were, as we noted, Great Britain, Italy, and France. But the 4th power, the Africa one, is the one that holds the key to the Ogaden conflict. Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia was successfully launching invasions into Somali-inhabited territories from the interior as part of his own rapid imperial expansion.
Which means the subsequent struggle for the Somalis was not just anti-colonial against distant Europeans.
No, it meant they faced a struggle against a powerful neighboring African empire that Somalis viewed as an equally foreign and deeply resented colonial subjugation.
Wow.
Complicated the dynamics immeasurably and set the stage for what is universally considered the foundational betrayal, the 1897 Anglo-Ethiopian Treaty, often called the Haud Treaty.
This betrayal, enshrined in a single treaty, is the direct legal origin of the Ogaden conflict that persists in various forms to this very day. How did this treachery unfold?
The cynicism is just stunning. The northern Somali clans had sought British protection in the 1880s for one reason above all: security against the better armed Ethiopians.
So that was the deal.
That was the deal. The British treaties they signed explicitly pledged never to cede, sell, mortgage, or otherwise give for Somali territory to any foreign power. It was a promise of defense, a guarantee of territorial integrity in exchange for protectorate status.
A promise Britain violated barely a decade later. demonstrating that the needs of empire always superseded the promises made to protectorates.
Completely. In the 1897 Rod Treaty, Britain unilaterally violated these pledges. It ceded large tracts of Somali territory to Ethiopia, including the Ogaden region, and critically, the vital highland grazing area known as the Haud.
Let's detail the significance of the Haud. Why was its loss so existential, not just politically inconvenient?
The Haud wasn't just a stretch of land. It was the seasonal lifeblood for half the entire population of the British Protectorate, primarily the Isaac and Gadabursi clans. It was the only reliable dry season pasture available.
So, it was essential for survival.
Absolutely. By ceding the Haud to Ethiopian administration, Britain effectively cut off the economic heart of their own protectorate and placed the control of Somali pastoral survival into the hands of a hostile foreign power.
And this was just a cynical geopolitical trade.
100%.
Yeah.
Britain was engaged in a massive regional struggle against the Mahdists in Sudan. Their primary goal was to secure Ethiopian neutrality and assistance and to gain commercial privileges for railway construction. They sacrificed the interests and the economic well-being of the Somalis under their protection to achieve a larger, immediate imperial goal.
So, they were acting without competence, legally speaking.
They were acting without competence and exceeding their jurisdiction because the Somalis had never granted them authority to transfer the land.
And the deceits surrounding this treaty compounded the betrayal.
The sources confirmed the process was defined by deception. The treaty was the British refused to inform them of its existence, and they were not consulted on the terms. This act of treachery created an unhealing wound, cementing the British as betrayers rather than protectors, and providing the nationalist movement with its most powerful enduring grievance.
Meanwhile, the Italian border was drawn with equal, though perhaps more accidental sloppiness.
Yes, the 1908 Italian-Ethiopian Convention was supposed to finalize the boundary with Italian Somaliland. But the fatal flaw, the ticking time bomb of that agreement, was Article 4. This article attempted to define the boundary by referencing a previous lost map line from 1897.
The lost map line?
The lost map line, which neither side could accurately verify or locate.
So, the border has never been delimited satisfactorily.
Precisely. This diplomatic ambiguity created a vast, large triangular area of questionable sovereignty. That abstract legal flaw did not stay abstract for long. It was the direct cause of the famous 1934 Walwal incident.
For our listeners, why should they remember the Walwal incident? What was that?
Because it wasn't just a minor skirmish over grazing rights, it was a military confrontation between Italian and Ethiopian troops, and an Italian-controlled Walwal right in that disputed zone. Italy used this incident, the direct result of the ambiguous 1908 border and as the casus belli, to launch its full-scale invasion of Ethiopia in 1935.
Sparking the Second Italo-Abyssinian War.
Exactly. The lines drawn in the sand were quite literally set up to fail and designed to create large-scale conflict.
So, when we look at the entire process of partition, as our sources summarize it, was fundamentally carried out without taking into consideration Somali aspirations, livelihoods, or territorial distinctions. There was no Somali leader present at any of these negotiating tables.
That is the core absurdity of the Westphalian model being imposed. Here we have that famous quote from Lord Salisbury, the British Prime Minister, discussing this period, talking about drawing lines upon maps where no white man's foot ever trod, giving away mountains and rivers and lakes to each other. We never knew exactly where they were.
Incredible.
The Somali nation was the casualty of European ignorance and indifference.
And the impact was more than just diplomatic. The imposed static, linear territorial logic criminalized the essential seasonal migrations along traditional migratory routes, effectively dismantling the economic foundation of the society.
It was a political and economic assault. The new boundaries dislocated populations and inflicted economic hardship and social inconvenience. By cutting people off from their vital traditional pastures and watering points in the Haud and the NFD, the partition created entirely new divisive geopolitical identities: Somali Ethiopian, Somali British, Somali French, where none had existed before. They were forced to adopt a primary political allegiance defined by a colonial power, not by their nation.
So the partition fragments the nation into 5 distinct pieces. But the divergent colonial policies applied to each of those pieces created profound and lasting disparities, what you call inherent incompatibilities, that functionally doomed the later attempt at unification.
Yes, let's start with the two territories that actually did unite: British Somaliland in the north and Italian Somaliland in the south. The moment of unification in 1960 meant trying to fuse two territories set on fundamentally opposing administrative trajectories.
British Somaliland, the Northern Territory, was a classic case of what the sources call indirect rule and benign neglect.
Precisely. The British governed lightly, relying on indigenous elders, which was cheap, and preserved native governance structures. But the price of this preservation was severe underdevelopment.
How so?
There was minimal investment in infrastructure, public health, or education. It was neglected because outside of the port of Berbera, it wasn't strategically or economically valuable. To the British Empire, literacy rates were abysmal, and the number of graduates was minimal.
Conversely, Italian Somaliland in the south, a formal colony and later a UN trust territory, received a direct assimilationist policy and a comprehensive economic plan.
A completely different approach. The Italians imposed a centralized bureaucratic administration, modeling it closely on European civil codes. Furthermore, as a UN trust territory after World War II, the international community invested heavily, particularly in large-scale agricultural plantations, especially bananas meant for export. As a result, the pace of development in the South far outpaced the British North.
You cannot just slam those two entities together and expect a stable state. The incompatibility was inherent not just in language, but in institutional function.
That's the crucial detail that the sources highlight. By 1960, they were functionally different countries. They had two different official languages, English versus Italian. Used in government and business, they had different legal and judicial systems. And this is where the real institutional failure lay.
How did those different legal traditions clash, in practical terms? I mean, what does that look like on day one of the new republic?
It was a fundamental operational paralysis. The British system in the north was based on English common law, precedent-based, evolving through case law and judicial interpretation. The Italian system in the south was based on continental civil code, statutory-based, rigid, and centered entirely on written legislation. When the unified legislature and judiciary were created, they could not function smoothly. Lawyers trained in British common law could not operate effectively within a civil code framework, and vice versa. Institutional procedures were completely incompatible, crippling the civil service and creating distrust in the legal system from the start.
So, the foundation of the new state was flawed before the cornerstone was even laid. Let's look at the third piece, the French outpost Djibouti, or French Somaliland.
Djibouti was strategically vital due to its port access to the Red Sea, and France was determined to keep it. Their colonial strategy was a textbook example of divide and rule.
How did they do that?
They actively and successfully managed the rivalry between the two main ethnic groups, the Afars, who were largely non-Somali, and the Somalis, who are primarily the Issa clan.
And this strategy was solely designed to prevent the territory from being absorbed by Pan-Somalism, correct?
Exactly. France knew that if the territory was allowed genuine self-determination, the Pan-Somali fervor would pull it toward unification. So, the referendums held in 1958 and 1967 both failed to deliver a union with the Somali Republic.
Why did they fail?
The failure was rooted in fear. The non-Somali Afar population feared marginalization in a Somali-dominated state where they would become a minor ethnic group.
And the sources indicate that the French authorities ensured this outcome was realized through political manipulation.
Oh yes, French authorities were accused of serious gerrymandering, suppressing Somali turnout, and actively deporting thousands of ethnic Somalis to ensure a pro-France result. Djibouti's eventual independence in 1977 as a Republic of Djibouti was a successful French geopolitical project. It ensured a small, manageable pro-Western client state and permanently prevented its absorption into the greater Somalia dream.
Moving south, the fourth piece, the Kenyan frontier. The Northern Frontier District, or NFD.
This area stretching across vast plains was exclusively inhabited by Somalis, but the British administered it as a closed district attached to the Kenya colony. This area represents one of the clearest post-colonial betrayals of democracy and self-determination.
And that betrayal occurred as Kenyan independence neared.
Exactly as Kenyan independence approached, the NFD Somalis, organized under the Northern Province People's Progressive Party, and vigorously sought union with the Somali Republic, citing their ethnic, linguistic, and religious unity. Britain, in response, appointed a commission that held a plebiscite in 1962.
And the result?
The sources are clear on the outcome. An overwhelming majority, estimated at 88% of the NFD population, favored union with the Somali Republic.
That is a clear democratic mandate for self-determination that was completely ignored.
Completely ignored, Britain prioritized the territorial integrity of the newly independent client state Kenya over the expressed democratic will of the people. In 1963, the NFD was handed over to Kenya, becoming the northeastern region. This set up immediate conflict because the incoming Kenyan government was not willing to give up the territory.
Another betrayal.
And this betrayal was a precursor to the OAU doctrine, prioritizing static colonial borders over the political rights of the inhabitants.
And finally, the fifth point of the star, the core grievance, the lost heartland, the Ethiopian territory, the Ogaden.
The Ogaden is the land that Britain ceded in the 1897 Betrayal, a region overwhelmingly inhabited by Somali people. Following World War II, the British military administration took control of the area. Somali nationalists, encouraged by this temporary reprieve, hoped for a reversal of the 1897 Betrayal and subsequent union.
But those hopes were dashed in the late 1940s and early 1950s.
Yes, the Ogaden was transferred back to Ethiopian control in stages 1948 and 1954, despite strenuous objections of Somali nationalists and massive demonstrations. Somali leaders argued that Ethiopia's claim was based purely on imperial expansion, backed by Britain's cynical treaty. For the Somali nation, this was not viewed as a simple border dispute. It was African colonial subjugation, a feeling of being ruled by an equally foreign power that had been empowered by the departing European colonizer.
So, by 1960, the map was a mess of incompatibility and betrayal. Two disparate territories uniting under illegal cloud. One French-controlled outpost kept separate by ethnic maneuvering, and two major Somali-inhabited territories, the Ogaden and the NFD, forcefully held within neighboring African states, all against the expressed will of the Somali people. The stage was set for an ideological explosion fueled by irredentism.
Pan-Somalism was the necessary political response to this fragmentation. It transformed a shared cultural identity into a powerful, unifying political mission, a direct nationalist rejection of the artificial colonial frontiers focused on the irredentist goal, the unification of a greater Somalia.
And the engine for this movement was the Somali Youth League, the SYL, founded in 1943.
The SYL was galvanized by the post-World War II international discussions over the fate of Italy's colonies. It quickly shifted from a cultural organization into a mass political movement focused entirely on Pan-Somalism. Their core goal was unequivocal: unification of all Somali territories under one rule.
They were ambitious.
Extremely. To demonstrate the depth of this commitment, they didn't just talk about the lost lands. They proposed Harar, a historic city deep inside the lost Ogaden territory, as the future capital of Greater Somalia. This showed the world and their own people that the redemption of the lost frontiers was the central, non-negotiable plank of nationalism.
And the flag, as we mentioned, became the ultimate symbol of this constitutional commitment.
Absolutely. The light blue rectangle with the white five-pointed star was a mission statement. Those 5 points explicitly represent the 5 regions in which Somalis reside. When the Somali Republic was declared in 1960, the flag acted as a constant national commitment that the nation was incomplete, and the 3 remaining points must be redeemed.
So, the state was constitutionally committed to hostility against 3 neighboring countries from day one:
Ethiopia, Kenya, and Djibouti, which was still French.
Yes, that ideological fervor, however, led directly to the flawed Union of 1960. The desire for immediate unification was so powerful that it overrode all practical and legal realities, cementing the incompatibilities at the heart of the new state.
The rush was just breathtaking. British Somaliland gained independence on June 26, 1960, and Italian Somaliland on July 1st. They merged immediately, driven by emotional unity. But the union was hasty and legally and politically flawed.
Where exactly was the legal void that continues to undermine the unity claim today, particularly for Somaliland?
Well, the essential legal document, the Act of Union, was never formally ratified. Through a bilaterally signed treaty, the legislatures in the North and the South rushed by the fervor of the moment, approved different, legally insufficient documents. The sources are definitive. The Union was built on a legal vacuum. There was no single binding instrument defining the terms of the merger.
So, the state was built on a constitutional flaw. In addition to trying to combine the inherent incompatibilities of the British and Italian administrative systems, which we just detailed.
The combination was crippling. The new state was extremely weak and impoverished. It struggled mightily with major administrative problems, trying to fuse two civil services that operated in different languages, under different legal philosophies, and with vast differences in training and education. The sophisticated Italian-trained South versus the neglected British-trained North.
And the North immediately felt marginalized within this unified state.
The marginalization was swift and severe. The power structure leaned heavily toward the more populous and developed South. Northern grievances included minor representation in the cabinet and civil service, and the use of Italian as the de facto working language in the central bureaucracy.
And this resentment manifested pretty quickly.
Very quickly. The new constitution, drafted mainly in the South, was put to a referendum in 1961, and a majority of voters
rejected it outright. And this immediate discontent escalated quickly, resulting in Northern officers attempting a coup in December 1961, less than 18 months after independence.
The attempted coup was a direct reflection of the Northern political elite feeling that the Pan-Somali ideal had led them into a flawed, ill-conceived union where they were subjugated. This clearly shows that the dream of Greater Somalia superseded sound, pragmatic state building, creating a potentially fatal constitutional flaw at birth and ensuring that future fragmentation would always have a historical and legal basis.
The Pan-Somali state, founded on the premise that its borders were illegitimate, had no choice but to fight to redeem those lost territories. And that led to two major defining conflicts that bankrupted the state and destroyed its political consensus.
Right?
The first was the shift to war from 1963 to 1967, fought over the Kenyan frontier. The NFD. The spark was the ultimate betrayal, Britain's decision to hand the NFD to Kenya. Despite the 1962 pro-union referendum result, Somalia responded immediately by severing diplomatic relations with the UK.
And this conflict demonstrates a crucial tactic used by the established post-colonial states to contain irredentism and silence, democratic demands, linguistic delegitimization. Kenya, backed by its former colonial master, publicly refused to acknowledge the ethnically based irredentist motives of the Somalis.
So, what did they call them instead?
They framed the entire political movement, the NPPP, and subsequent insurgents, as a problem of shifta.
Which means bandits, a metaphor for criminality and otherness.
Exactly. This framing allowed the Kenyan state to ignore the political motivation and excuse a brutal counterinsurgency campaign as merely fighting crime. Kenya declared a state of emergency, forcing pastoralists, the backbone of the Somali economy, into protected villages.
Which were described as what?
Which our sources grimly describe as essentially concentration camps.
And the strategy seems designed to dismantle the very way of life of the people seeking secession.
It was a conscious effort to destroy the nomadic economy. Kenya launched Operation Fajia Shifta, which included massacres and the systemic confiscation and killing of livestock. This caused large-scale disruption, intentionally forcing a shift from pastoralism to a difficult sedentary lifestyle, thereby destroying the mobility that had always been integral to Somali independence and identity.
The war ended with a 1967 ceasefire brokered by Zambia, but the NFD remained Kenyan. The legacy, however, was a total marginalization and state of dissatisfaction that persists in that region today, creating a permanent hostile internal frontier within Kenya.
But the main event, the ultimate test of the Pan-Somali dream and the mission encoded in the flag, was the Ogaden War, 1977 to 1978.
This was the moment of reckoning. Dictator Siad Barre, who had seized power in a military coup in 1969, launched a full-scale invasion of Ethiopia in 1977, seeking to reclaim the lost heartland and capitalize on Ethiopia's internal instability following the 1974 revolution. Somalia made initial rapid gains, pushing deep into the Ogaden with its well-trained army.
The confidence was high and initially justified. Somalia's military was arguably one of the most professional in Africa at the time, trained and equipped by the Soviet Union. By the height of the summer of 1977, the Western Somali Liberation Front, backed by the Somali National Army, controlled nearly 90% of the Ogaden.
Ethiopia was on the brink of collapse.
Completely. But then came the single most decisive moment, the stunning Cold War reversal.
A total flip in the alliances.
A total dramatic geopolitical flip that sealed Somalia's fate. The Soviet Union, which had been Somalia's primary military patron for over a decade, training and arming Barre's army, abandoned him overnight. Moscow viewed the new Marxist regime, the Derg in Ethiopia, as the bigger prize in the Horn of Africa.
Why?
Due to Ethiopia's strategic location along the Red Sea and its larger population base.
So, Ethiopia, which was on the verge of defeat, was saved by an overwhelming, immediate, and massive Soviet response.
We need to grasp the sheer scale of this intervention to understand the shockwaves it sent through Somalia. We're talking about a $1 billion massive airlift of military supplies from the USSR, a huge logistical undertaking, moving tanks, artillery, and fighter jets across oceans. This was combined with the immediate deployment of more than 12,000 Cuban soldiers and airmen.
12,000 Cubans?
12,000. Plus thousands of Yemeni and East German troops, alongside 1,500 Soviet advisors.
For our listener to visualize this reversal, what exactly did that airlift look like on the ground? Was this the largest single military aid package to Africa at that time?
It was certainly one of the fastest and largest military logistical operations in African history. The airlifts often involve hundreds of flights per day, moving material and personnel from Eastern Europe and Cuba directly into Ethiopia. The Somali National Army, while professional, was utterly outclassed. They were overwhelmed by the sudden arrival of mechanized Soviet firepower, hundreds of tanks, multiple squadrons of advanced MiGs, crewed by highly disciplined Cuban forces. They went from being the hunter to the hunted. In the space of 3 months, they were utterly defeated and forced to retreat by March 1978.
And the consequences for Somalia were apocalyptic, reaching right into the modern era.
This was physical, political, and ideological suicide for the state. Militarily, Somalia suffered crippling losses. The army lost almost a third of the regular SNA soldiers, 3/8 of the armored units, and half of the Somali Air Force.
Wow.
Economically, the war caused economic ruin that Somalia never recovered from. And politically, Siad Barre's regime, having staked its entire legitimacy on the Pan-Somalism dream and the 5.0 star, now faced heavy disapproval from its population and the immediate shattering loss of its raison d'etre.
The catastrophic loss created an ideological vacuum and exposed the regime's weakness, leading directly to the revolt in the army that began immediately after the defeat. This revolt eventually spiraled into the ongoing Somali civil war. The Ogaden defeat was the catalyst for the state's total self-destruction.
And as catastrophic as the military failure was, Somalia's irredentist wars were always doomed by the diplomatic contexts that had been carefully established by the newly independent African states. They had built a solid cage around Somalia's ambitions.
You're referring to the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, and the doctrine of uti possidetis juris.
Yes. The OAU, formed in 1963, recognized immediately that border problems constitute a grave and permanent factor of dissension across the continent. So in July 1964, at its first ordinary session in Cairo, the OAU passed the landmark Cairo Resolution, which solemnly declares that all member states pledged themselves to respect the borders existing on their achievement of national independence.
This was an act of collective self-preservation, wasn't it? If Somalia succeeded in breaking colonial boundaries based on ethnic unity, it set a dangerous precedent for every other artificially constructed nation in Africa.
Precisely, OAU members were acutely vulnerable because nearly all their own borders were artificial lines drawn without reference to ethnic realities. Leaders feared that if Somalia were successful, the example might inspire their own restive minorities divided by frontiers, leading to a continent-wide descent into border wars and ethnic secession.
So they chose stability over self-determination.
They pragmatically chose continental stability and the sanctity of the inherited colonial map over the principle of self-determination.
So, in one resolution, the OAU retroactively ratified the entire 19th century colonial partition of Africa, providing the full legal and diplomatic backing for the 1897 betrayal of the Ogaden and the ignored NFD referendum.
It provided the diplomatic cage that made Pan-Somalism impossible to achieve through negotiation. Somalia was the only nation that dissented from the resolution, declaring it unacceptable.
And their legal argument was valid. Wasn't it that the OAU resolution conflicted with the UN principle of self-determination? Resolution 1514, arguing that self-determination was a universal principle, not just one limited to the moment of decolonization.
While legally sound on paper, that argument was politically toxic and isolated them entirely.
Right?
Somalia was alienated by the OAU for challenging the established order. The response was not supported, but containment.
Right?
Ethiopia and Kenya, the two most directly threatened states, immediately signed a mutual defense pact, solidifying their common front against Somalia. The OAU's decision had forced Somalia's hand. The diplomatic door was slammed shut, leaving war. And as we saw suicidal war as the only remaining option to fulfill the promise of the five-pointed star. And
So, what does this all mean? We've traced the line from the 1897 betrayal through the flawed union driven by the five-pointed star to the catastrophic military failure in the Ogaden and the diplomatic cage of the OAU. The story doesn't end in 1978. The 19th century partition remains the active, unresolved fault line.
it is the root problem. The 1978 Ogaden defeat directly catalyzed the state collapse of 1991. When Pan-Somalism, the great unifying ideology, failed Siad Barre's regime, desperate to maintain control and find a new foundation for legitimacy, desperately tried to suppress clan and regional identities.
How did Barre attempt to suppress the clan identity that had always been the functional social contract of the nation?
He tried to replace it with a centralized Marxist-tinged nationalism. He launched aggressive land reform programs, tried to erase clan names from public records, and even renamed cities and districts to break historical associations.
But that backfired.
It failed spectacularly. By trying to suppress the very social structure that held society together, he only drove clan loyalties underground, transforming them from social structures into armed political opposition movements that were ready to revolt immediately after the military defeat. This accelerated the slide into civil war and state collapse.
With the state's fall in 1991, Pan-Somalism was totally orphaned. The fragmentation that followed was a violent reversion back to the only other viable structure the people knew: the pre-colonial clan structure and regional loyalties.
And the most profound modern echo of the partition is the Republic of Somaliland, the former British protectorate, which redeclared its independence in 1991. The contrast between Somaliland's relative stability, which rebuilt its local governance based heavily on traditional clan elders and hair, and the persistent state failure in the south, which descended into warlordism, is a direct living consequence of the divergent colonial legacies we discussed.
And Somaliland's claim isn't secession in the traditional sense. It's a restoration of sovereignty based on the dissolution of the legally and politically flawed 1960 Union.
Their entire legal argument rests on the structural flaws created by the partition, that they achieved independence separately as a sovereign entity, that the 1960 Act of Union was never formally ratified, and that the 1961 Constitution was explicitly rejected by a majority of their voters.
So they're arguing the Union never really existed legally.
They are arguing that the experiment of forcing the underdeveloped British system and the advanced Italian system together failed due to the inherent incompatibilities created by a century of divergent colonial rule.
So the current political map, the de facto independent Somaliland, the autonomous Puntland, a fragmented South and Somali region firmly within Ethiopia and Kenya, is essentially a reversion to that pre-colonial realm of competing polities. But now scarred by the administrative and legal legacies of the colonial era, the ghost of 1897 still haunts the region.
And the instability continues, We see this with the recent 2024 Memorandum of Understanding between Ethiopia and Somaliland over Red Sea port access. Ethiopia's recognition of Somaliland reignites all the old tensions over statehood, sovereignty, and conflict, particularly in Mogadishu, which views this as a violation of its internationally recognized territory. The forgotten frontiers are not forgotten at all. They continue to define regional instability and geopolitical tension today, just as they did a century ago.
We've taken this incredible journey from sophisticated pre-colonial sultanates through the shock of the 1897 betrayal that seeded the Haud, the flawed union driven by the five-pointed star, to the catastrophic military failure in the Ogaden and the diplomatic cage of the OAU. It's a profound tragedy that the Somali nation was forced to choose between an ideologically pure but geographically impossible state, the Greater Somalia dream, or diplomatic reality.
And that choice shattered the state. The ultimate question left for the Somali nation is whether unity must precede stability, or if stability achieved in fragmentation, as Somaliland is demonstrated by relying on indigenous structures like Xeer, is the necessary painful step before any form of lasting political reunion can ever be discussed. The map remains volatile because the lines drawn by dead empires have never been erased from the national psyche.
The profound question indeed. Thank you for guiding us through this deep history of the Horn of Africa. And thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We hope this has given you a clearer, longer view of the forces still shaping global politics today. We invite you to continue exploring the deep roots of this complex